much for the introduction. And thank you everyone and Namat for inviting me, and truly thank you for keeping this event going. It's one of the hardest things to be muzzled when you really need to scream because you're in so much pain. So to keep this event going and to have it happening today is a powerful act. And I'm very honored to be part of this conversation.
No, she heard. Okay, just a second. The cable is out. Just a second.
All right.
No, it's good the way it is. Yeah, that's right. That's good.
So,
oh yeah.
Should I continue?
Yes,
yeah. Okay. Anyway, I hope you heard my thanks. But thank you. All right. So my presentation. And thank you, Nama and Nurhan, honestly, because I feel like you're going to make my presentation easier because, you know, the Palestinian history is so long and complicated and layered, and it's so hard to talk about it in one event, let alone in a presentation. So I think there's a bit of a divine intervention that there's a good, I think, narrative progression. So in my presentation, I'm going to take a bit of a more focused lens into the Palestine camps and the sort of the spatial dimension and why they are targeted, obviously, in this genocidal war. And the title of my presentation is What is a Home in Gaza? And there's a subtitle, but the main title of this presentation was firstly inspired by a statement writer and professor Rifat al-Arir enunciated just a bit over a month before an Israeli strike killed him on December 6th in Gaza city. And the presentation attempts to illustrate a historical understanding into the Palestine refugee camps. And this is in a way to demonstrate why architecture, or how architecture and space making takes center stage in the construction and destruction of violent projects such as the Israeli settler colonial one undertake. And further, why our camps are at the heart of targeting the Palestinian struggle, existence, and resistance. So this is what Rifat shared in an interview on October. And he was saying, for example, when I say Israel targeted a home, what's a home? A home in America and the UK, 2 people, a couple, a kid, a dog. But in Gaza, a home is a generational building. So to really unpack what all this means, we have to, as you know, my previous also colleagues attempted to do, is go back to where did all this start? And from the onset, I'm assuming a lot of people are familiar with the history of Palestine, but just to give a very, very summarized understanding, from the onset of the Jewish immigration into Palestine, which you can see in the top 2 images, as opposed to what resulted because of this immigration in the 2 bottom images. So as refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe, under the Zionist project of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, were arriving into Palestine. Space and space making was one of the first tools of, in a way, factualizing and making a Jewish state in Palestine. So while Jewish immigrants were coming in, they did not integrate into the spatial contiguity or the spatial nature of Palestine. And this is before it was officially declared as an Israeli state, because they were coming in from the late 1800s. And what they did is they created these spaces in the forms of moshava, a colony, or a kibbutz, gatherings, or moshav, settlements. And these spaces were built on a collective existence and a communal existence, and on land that was owned. As opposed to what was happening to the Palestinians, they were displaced, forcefully displaced, through massacres and destruction and genocide and rape, you know, things that we're hearing echoed today as well in Gaza. And they were displaced out of Palestine into spaces that would become refugee camps. And you can see at the bottom right an image of that. Now, while they shared the similar nature of collectiveness and communal being, one was about building up prosperity and livelihood. The other one was about a way of destroying it. And while the former was owned land by Jewish-funded agencies, the latter was land given to Palestinians at the disposal of the different host governments and serviced by UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, and the land was deemed right of use. So it's not owned, it's only allowed for Palestinians to use. Now, they've been using it for 75 years, and the land is rented for 99 years. So it already is clear how this dilemma of temporality and permanence, which Namat touched upon, started. So really, historically, the Palestinian camp and Palestinian space is historically a space of resistance. It resists displacement, it resists poverty, which was sudden, it resists illiterateness. We know that Palestinians are the highest illiterate amongst the Middle Eastern populations, but even in the world, they're amongst the highest. It also resists this hybrid identity of whether you're Palestinian, Jordanian, Palestinian, Syrian, Palestinian, Lebanese, Palestinian within Palestine displaced. And it also resists the political, physical, and spatial oppression. And what Noor Masalha talks about, it resists memoricide, which really is happening in Gaza today, the complete erasure of anything that connotes the memory of also the displacement in Gaza. And most of all, it's a resistance to stolen space. So to give you also a better idea, how did Palestinian camps evolve and how were they set up? So Palestinian camps across the 5 host countries, which are Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and then we have West Bank and Gaza inside occupied Palestine. So a bit of confusion there, but these are 5 host countries, and Palestinian camps pretty much were set up and evolved in a similar fashion spatially, yet each would be obviously contextualized within the host government policies and politics and geopolitics. But this is an example, the Hija camp in the West Bank. They would begin by setting up tents in 1948, 1950, and then after the 1967 war as well. And then UNRWA would start regulating, ordering spatially these camps through turning a lot of the tents into barracks, into rooms. And then you would have a spatial order. And this was not done by mistake. This was done because everyone understood that this will be a protracted displacement and that there will be resistance from the Palestinians towards their forced displacement and stolen land. So it was a method of controlling what could become and what had become the Palestinian liberation and revolution, and to specially control it because they understood camps were the densest gatherings of Palestinians who are most disadvantaged, and that's where pretty much liberation and resistance will emanate from, and it did. But over time, over 75 years of protracted displacement, these camps became high, dense, city-like urban fabrics, and they continue to grow. And as you can see in the foreground, there's these cement columns with metal going up. And this is in a way an indication of just displaced time prolonged. So, as Rifat said, this is generational building. These columns are an indication of the family just not knowing, will the next generation build up? And so camps keep growing within a bordered space. And what that causes is something like this in Lebanon, in Burj al-Barajna camp. So a specialty that began as we said, either tents or small barracks would become this very dense and urbanized speciality, and it only grows vertically. And again, this is because 2 primary factors play a role. One is the fact that the UN and the international community refused to enact the right of return clause, which has been adopted repeatedly at the United Nations, and it allows refugees who would like to be repatriated to go back to Palestine. And second, which I just mentioned, is the bordering of the camps. None of the camps, and there are today 58 officially recognized camps, but there were many that were destroyed. None of them have grown in border 1 centimeter. So inevitably, camps will grow vertically, and they will grow in very dense spatialities. So to go back to the generational meaning of home. So this is one building I've been sort of observing and monitoring in Burj Al Baradna camp. And this is literally what Rifat was talking about. It's generational in terms of, you know, whenever someone needs to be married or whenever someone has the means within one family, they will build space. And it doesn't even have to be this ordered space, one on top of the other. You can see in sometimes they determined that, for instance, this space is reserved for a different member of family, and this member was able to find the means to build up. But it creates this very unique form of architecture that is only existing in camps, and which I sort of argue is a specific Palestinian scale. And it's very much informed by the first instance of displacement, by the forms of collective and social groupings, and by also the continued resistance to being resettled in a third country and to the oppression that's economical and social and spatial. Now, how do these camps actually grow also in this sort of very dense form that is beyond the ordered layout that the UN and the host governments laid out at the beginning, is because refugees enact something called acts of spatial violations, and which I write about as well. So these acts are actually illegal, and they're deemed illegal by the UN and by the host governments, yet they're tolerated. And they're tolerated for a reason, because if they weren't tolerated, there would be much more anger inside the camps, and there would be much more forms of resistance. So in some ways, this is the political negotiation spatially. So we'll tolerate your building up, as long as this means you will not, in a way, erupt in other forms of resistance. So while they are tolerated, they are very vulnerable because they could be dismantled or they could be destroyed at any moment legally. This is just another image that shows the same building also just, you know, generationally being built up over time. So this is existing in all Palestinian camps. Now, what these acts and what this building up has also produced is a very sort of scale that is actually greatly utilized, let's say, during conflict. So these spaces and these scales prove to be detrimental, actually, in the Palestinian camp, because they've, in a way, reached a threshold that is now threatening to the host governments. So how has this Palestinian scale I've been talking about, built through the acts of spatial violations, really, you know, meant on the ground? What did it look like, and what does it mean on the ground? So in camps in Jordan, for instance, this is Baqa camp in Jordan, and it's the biggest and, let's say, the noisiest camp, where mostly the demonstrations and the Palestinian forms of resistance happen, because it's also the largest camp. But historically, in Baqa camp, whenever what the Jordanian gendarme or Jordanian government would in a way term unrest, but they are really just demonstrations and protests against their obviously displacement and against things happening in Palestine, because camps are very much connected to what happens in Palestine. They reverberate instantly. But whenever something like this would erupt, it usually ends with the gendarmes stationing themselves at camp entrances. Yet they leave this sort of what I call a 4 meter of tension. And what this 4 meter is in a way, a recognition from both sides that, okay, you both have power. The gendarme has the power to oppress and the Palestinians have the power to resist, yet let's engage in a sort of less violent spatial dialogue. So usually it takes hours of name calling, of Palestinians chanting, throwing sometimes rocks, and then the gendarme throwing a lot of tear gas at the Palestinians. But this has been sort of the mode of agonism, let's say, which Chantal Mouffe talks about, of recognition of both powers, yet not one totally overpowering the other. Now, what the Jordanian government decided to do is to embark on a form of rescaling the camps spatially. And they do that by cutting through the camp, opening up these wide corridors that bifurcates the camp into two pretty much spatial entities. And then in Baqa camp specifically, the image you just saw was actually on this pathway, which is called the Intifada Street. And they pretty much decided to widen that street as well. Now, why did they do that? It's because when I was in 2015 in Baqa camp, for the first time, the gendarme tanks were able to actually enter the camp. So there was a protest in anger. I'm not sure if you remember in 2015, 3 settlers burnt alive Muhammad Abu Khdair. And there was a protest in Baqa camp in anger of that. And of course, it ended with, again, the usual confrontation between the gendarmes and the refugees. Now, what the refugees tried to do, understanding that the widened street, the blue one I showed you, will allow the tanks to come through, they tried to burn tires to, in a way, block their Intifada street, where they usually protest. But after hours and hours, the tanks were able to overcome the fire and drove through, and they were able to actually then disperse themselves into the camp fabric and arrest a lot of refugees. And this was the first time that this happened, and it was only enabled by these spatial means that the host government has adopted. Another form of host government spatial policies is a much more violent one, which the Lebanese government adopted in Nahr al-Bared camp in 2007, and many other camps before that, but this is the most recent episode in north of Lebanon in Tripoli. So it was completely destroyed, and what happened is the refugees had to go through an arduous negotiation with the government through the UN, insisting that they want to go back to their camp. They don't want to be resettled in other camps. So after over a year of negotiations, the government agreed, yet what they demanded was that the camp has to be redesigned and relaid out into wider pathways. And I think the smallest pathway was 4 meters, which still allows a tank to go through. So this is the left, you can see the original fabric. On the right, you can see the new scale. So I don't think I have to tell you that this is about controlling the camps, controlling any forms of resistance and uprising inside the camps. Another example in Jenin, in West Bank, in 2002, the center of Jenin, the heart of Jenin, was also completely destroyed by the Israeli forces. And what happened after reconstruction is what you see on the right, the 2 images. So this was the fabric or the spatial scale before reconstruction. And on the right, you can see after reconstruction, again, to allow the complete penetration, instant penetration and control of Palestinian resistance. So now what's happening in Gaza? What's happening in Gaza, I think, is different. And I personally see it as an Israeli form of implementing a complete erasure through complete destruction. What you see in front of you here are some statements that were said by some of, the highest level of Israeli government and military heads. And these statements were actually used in the ICJ case, South Africa versus Israel, to illustrate and demonstrate that there was genocidal intent when the ground invasion started. Now, as my colleagues also mentioned, there are 8 refugee camps in Gaza. Half of Gaza's population lives in those camps, but 80% of Gaza's population are refugees, displaced since 1948. So Gaza is really a refugee, in a way, population. Now, as you can see on the right, the population density revolves around those camps. So they're the densest in people, in bodies, and the densest in spatiality. And these were the areas that Israel has been and still is targeting for complete destruction and erasure. This is a closer look at Jabalia camp, the largest camp in Gaza and one that has been brutally destroyed. But you can understand that the camp fabric, as you can see on the left, is a fabric that is very much tight and very much houses an enormous number of bodies. So whenever you hit a fabric that's tight and dense, you're obviously gonna inflict maximum loss of human bodies and human life. And this is why the Israelis and the host governments target those camps. So we go back to this idea of generational building, and Jabalia camp in the 70s looked like something, ordered, low density. And then over time, it's been built up to reach a density like we see on the right in 2020. And this is, as we said, a density that will undoubtedly cause collateral damage beyond any targets. There is no specific target or no, in a way, surgical target that can happen in spatiality like that. And this is what we see. The Israeli army, the Israeli government claims that they have very specific information on where a Hamas-affiliated member lives in one of those camp buildings. But what we see is an enormous destruction of the largest and widest human life that they can inflict, let alone the spatial and infrastructural ones. Yet the camp in the Palestinian space remains a space of historical resistance. And what we see today is, vast amounts of refugee camps being installed in Gaza, mainly in the southern parts of Gaza. And what we can see is people already instantly are starting to also create forms of life and forms of sociality and forms of resistance. And this is really a testament that Palestinians value life probably more than anyone else who is living on this earth. And it's because they have experienced so much loss of life. And it's when you experience this much loss that you really appreciate what it is that you can instantly lose. And, you can also see how there is still this appreciation and this gentleness in even how space is created and constructed and how it's made inside these camps. They're building tents around greenery, existing greenery. They're building these beautiful social, intimate spaces that are, that allow for some privacy so that it can accommodate our cultural and customary ways of life. At the same time, it has this beautiful communal and collective sharing of in a way, destiny and resistance. And I'd like to end with a message that I received from a colleague in Gaza. And he sent me this image of this beautiful girl in one of the camps who makes paper kites for the kids in one of the refugee camps, and she just gives them out for free. But in some ways, this was amazing because it really resonates with what I also wanted to end with. And it's a very short poem that was written by Rifat Al-Arir, who inspired this presentation with what is a Home in Gaza statement. But his poem is titled If I Must Die. And there's a beautiful connotation between the kites. And I would like to play it, and maybe the words, I've translated the words here, can resonate as you hear Rifat's last words. And the poem is going to be read by Brian Cox, the famous actor. Sorry, I'm just trying to see how I can play it. There we go.
If I Must Die by Rifat Alaria, November the 1st, 2023. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale.
Thank you.